Well, welcome everybody to this event for us to talk about September 11 Feminist Perspectives, a book that was published in 2002, 1 year after September 11, 2001. So afterwards, there will be a chance to ask questions or put notes in the chat. But here we go to start. We respectfully acknowledge the wisdom of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and their custodianship of the lands and waterways which have never been ceded. The lands on which Spinifex offices are located are Jiru, Bunurong and Wurundjeri, Wadawurrung, Eora and Noongar. We also acknowledge the many women throughout history who have fought for women's freedom, often at the cost of their lives. So this evening, we will hear from the following speakers. I'll open with a short speech. Diane Bell, Kalpana Sharma, Farida Akhter, Urvashi Butalia, Evelyn Akkad, and Bronwyn Winter. As I said, it will be possible to ask questions after all have spoken. It's probably best if you use the hand raise in the reactions box at the bottom of your screen. So I'm going to do something weird, which is to introduce myself in the third person. So here goes. Susan Hawthorne is a poet, novelist, political commentator, and publisher. Among her non-fiction books are Wild Politics, Feminism, Globalization and Biodiversity, 2002, and Vortex, The Crisis of Patriarchy, 2020, in which she examines terrorism, fundamentalism, and the horrors of torture. She has written about war, the logic of unilateralism, free trade, and violence against lesbians. She is adjunct professor at James Cook University, Townsville, and lives on Jiru land in far north Queensland. So earlier this week, Corazon Fabros wrote me an email, and she said, although the articles were written in 2001, in the aftermath of the Twin Towers bombing, they could have been written yesterday. All the elements of the global war on terror exist to this day. It was pretty clear from the start that there would not be much thought put into the US retaliation against Al-Qaeda and Afghanistan, with Bush mouthing phrases like fighting evil or going on crusade. And in the years following, with the invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the subsequent war in Syria since 2011. This book was crucial in documenting feminist voices against the war. Bronwyn and I were both seeing messages and articles in email lists, in newspapers and magazines. And we decided that this had to be documented because we know how women's voices keep getting erased. Who would do it if we didn't? It turned out that Kalpana Sharma and Amud Joseph were also doing it in India with Kali for Women. But these were the only two feminist books released internationally. The Revolutionary Association of the Women of Afghanistan, RAWA, had been warning for a long time about fundamentalism and its impact on women. Cynthia Enloe had been speaking and writing about the ways in which masculinity is entrenched in foreign policy. Unless feminist analyses of male violence are taken seriously, there will never be an end to war. Feminist analyses do exist, but they are simply not listened to or allowed to reach a broader public. Rawa also pointed out that it was support from the USA that created the germ of the Taliban, and it was not the case that Afghani women were not ready for democracy. In the 1970s, Rawa used feminist principles to fight for women's rights, democracy, and secularism. But with the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1979, the rise of the Mujahideen and the Northern Alliance, then Al-Qaeda, and the US-led invasion in 2001, the shift to strong patriarchal forces sidelined any real possibility of feminist politics gaining any traction. The errors the miscalculations and the ignorance that have peppered the last 20 years of the US, the UK and Australia and others has been monumental, the latest of which we have seen in the last 2 weeks. I hope that with our speakers tonight, we can unpack some of that and get a clearer feminist perspective on September 11 and the years since. I'm now going to pass to Diane Bell. Professor Diane Bell is a feminist anthropologist and social justice advocate, the author of 10 books, including Daughters of the Dreaming and Ngarrindjeri Wurrung, and in 2021 was awarded an Order of Australia, an OAM. When the Pentagon was hit, she was living and working in Washington, DC. The re-election of George Bush Jr. in 2004 brought her home, where her work continued with Ngarrindjeri people and the environmental issues in South Australia. And since 2013, she has lived on Ngunnawal country in Canberra. Over to you, Di.
Thanks, Sue. And greetings from Ngunnawal country in the chilly capital of Australia, Canberra. I pay my respects to the Ngunnawal, the traditional owners, and in particular, I pay my respect to their sustaining stories of this country, stories from which we could learn a lot. This is my story now. On that bright morning in September 2001, this feminist was in Washington, DC, walking to my office where, as Director of Women's Studies at the George Washington University, I would be meeting with graduate students, and we would be and continuing to settle into our newly furbished 19th century row house, fondly known as the Little White House. A safe place brimming with hope, ideas, serious feminist scholarship and advocacy. Violence against women in times of war and peace, at home and abroad, was on our agenda. It was about to become very real. We spent 9/11 underground in the dug basement of our little house. We did not know if Washington was under attack. We did know the Pentagon had been hit. We could hear the ambulances arriving at the hospital some 10 metres from our front door. The White House was a mere 6 blocks away. George Bush Jr., the newly elected 43rd President of the United States of America, was not at home that day, but the Cold War generals of his father, George Bush, the 41st President of the US, were already busy. In confronting his existential crisis, George Bush Jr. would follow their playbook, redeem his father's failed Desert Storm, entrench a belligerent, bullying, flag-waving nationalism, curtail civil liberties in the name of security, enact legislation that expanded the reach of surveillance in ways hitherto deemed intolerable in the land of the free. Enemy combatants were sequestered without trial at Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib prison. In Abu Ghraib prison, truth-telling torture techniques were photographed. The vast population of the US looked away. Human rights, the right to privacy, legal representation, innocent until proved guilty, were waived. How was this achieved? My anthropological training suggests decoding symbols and unpicking binaries might be helpful. Symbols work because a number of meanings are condensed into one single icon, a cross, a yellow ribbon, a flag. They can be read at different levels with different meanings to different people and at different times. And one of the things feminists have done is unpick them and unpack them. In the first Gulf War, the yellow ribbons worn by the grateful nation made it impossible to challenge the nature of the sacrifice for the troops who were fighting for our liberty. Post 9/11, the flag stood for the solidarity of the nation, of going to war under the flag, of saluting the flag as members of this one big family, of sacrificing for loved ones. You're for us or against us, said Bush, and God, a Christian God, was made manifest in the title of his Desert Crusade. When binaries such as citizen, foreigner, good, evil are encoded, they fuse and they silence critical analysis. If evil emanates from other, there is no need to scrutinise self. To prove one is a citizen and good, one must be loyal. And the flag says, I am a patriot. To be a non-citizen is dangerous. A compliant and threatened media failed to disrupt the narrative of George Bush, that the USA was attacked because it was a beacon for freedom. Dissent was dangerous. Programs were cancelled. Tenured professors were dismissed. Those who disabled the alignment of loyalty and citizen were immediately suspect and needed to be taught the rules of combatants. I was a foreigner, but I resisted learning the repressive rules. I left the US when George Bush was re-elected. I thought Australia was a safe place, but we have followed in lockstep, allowed the Fox News to define our national interest, watched as successive governments have silenced dissent, increased surveillance, expanded the reach of homeland security, and challenged the loyalty of non-citizens who worked with our troops in Afghanistan. And women, where are their voices, their analysis, their security? My students' questions about violence at home and abroad persist. What might they be saying today of this concept of moral responsibility? So September 11, can I get this? Yes, September 11, that round that way. September 11, Feminist Perspectives is replete with awkward questions, dangerous, necessary questions that contributors have posed. They resonate with the unfolding crisis in Afghanistan. I look forward to hearing from the members of the panel as they share their stories. And I will just share my hashtag for the day with you, which is #ConstantVigilance. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Di. Our next speaker is Kalpana Sharma. She is an independent journalist and author with almost 5 decades as a journalist and specialising in developmental and environmental issues and gender. She's worked with Himmat Weekly, The Times of India and The Hindu. She was consulting editor with Economic and Political Weekly and readers editor with Scroll.in. In 2003, she was co-editor with Amu Joseph of the only other feminist critique of September 11 in book form, Terror, Counter-Terror, Women Speak Out, published by Kali for Women. Thank you, Kalpana.
Hello, and thank you. It's nice to put faces to the names that I have known. So I'm very happy to be here. Greetings from monsoony Mumbai, very hot and humid. Listening just now to you, Diane Bell, you could have been talking about what's happening in India. It's, the resonance of what you were saying about non-citizens, anti-national, we are facing all that here. And in fact, the fact of this meeting taking place prompted me to read again both the book that Susan and Bronwyn had edited and this one, which Amu Joseph and I put together, Terror, Counter-Terror, which Kali for Women, which was still together and has not split into 2, published. And it's strange reading those essays because many of them are so prescient and they could be almost talking about what's happening today. And I think it's a very good exercise to go back to those essays and read them and see, in a sense, almost how prophetic the feminists were when they wrote what they did in 2001, and see it in the context of what is happening today in Afghanistan. So I want to speak not so much about Afghanistan. I've never been there. I follow it, like I think most of you do, through the media. And in India particularly, we don't have correspondents based in Afghanistan. Very few journalists have been there. So the filter through which we get our news from Afghanistan is the Western filter of the international media and what it puts through. What I thought might be of interest is not just some of the things in the 2 anthologies which I felt had relevance for us today, but also how I see what is happening in Afghanistan as reflecting on what is happening in my own country. So as far as the essays go, as I said, I mean, really, you can read, you can just pick any essay and you will find there is something of relevance. But one of those which even then I found extremely relevant was Rosalind Paczewski's essay, which I think both our anthologies had, where she talks about, she likens the terrorist networks and global capitalism to phantom twin towers. And she writes in quotes, locked in a battle over wealth, imperial aggrandizement, and the meanings of masculinity. It is a battle that could well end in a stalemate, an interminable cycle of violence that neither can win. Just think about it as what is happening now in 2021. Coming to Afghanistan, what has struck me, and I've just in the last days, because that is my job as a journalist, I've read through the agreement that the Trump administration came through with the Taliban last year. There's no mention of human rights or women's rights. And it's an irony that, in the end, of course, these didn't matter. And yet there is this narrative going on, in the media about women's rights and human rights in Afghanistan once the Taliban takes over. And I was trying to get my head around, how do I, as a woman sitting in India, understand this and what is going on? One of the things I heard only a couple of days ago was a podcast on The Takeover, which is on New York Public Radio, between the author Rafia Zakaria and an Afghan woman called Amani Al-Khatatbe, I don't know whether I'm pronouncing it correctly, who's the founder of the organization called Muslim Girl. And it was a critique of Western media's coverage of Afghan women. And, I write a column critiquing the media, so I was particularly interested in it. But the one thing they questioned was the narrative of the liberal West saving Muslim women that has dominated the discussions on the status of women in Afghanistan in the last 2 decades. And they were critical of this savior narrative, apart from also they brought in some things on white feminism, which we need not discuss here. And I think this question of savior is something that we have to think about, because even as we acknowledge the very real fear and grief that a whole generation of women who have grown up in a country without the shadow of the Taliban must be going through, and that there is no question that there has been a very real transformation in the lives of these women, particularly those living in urban areas, principally Kabul. What we know less about are the conditions that have governed the lives of the women in rural Afghanistan. I mean, I've looked hard to find, writings on this, and really I have no clue what they must have gone through, what they must be thinking, particularly because these were the areas where the theater of war over the last 2 decades actually played out, particularly through the American bombings on suspected Taliban bases. And these were the ordinary women, men, and children who were dismissed as collateral damage of America's war against terror. So what were their lives like in the last 2 decades? That's something I would still like to know. And I don't think that the media particularly has focused on this or reported on it. And I think to understand it would perhaps add to our understanding of what is happening in Afghanistan today. So as I said earlier, I cannot speak on Afghanistan because I've never been there, but I can discuss in a way something that makes me think about our own situation here in India, where, we have a democracy. Now increasingly it's becoming more of an autocracy. We have laws and the constitution has guaranteed equal rights to women. Yet we get daily reminders how little our society has changed in its attitudes towards women. I mean, even today, a woman's worth continues to be weighed by the dowry she can bring when she gets married. And women are killed in numbers for not bringing enough. I mean, you look at the newspapers and you'll get these reports. Even today, if a woman is raped, as many women are every day, today again, there is another big case. And particularly the women from the lower castes or the marginalized community, she's shunned, treated as spoiled goods, and essentially told she's as good as a living corpse. I mean, this is happening today. We've discussed this decades back, when there was a fight to change the rape laws. And for those women who seek justice, even today, the criminal justice system in this country continues to be skewed against them. So the point I'm making is, even though India is vastly different from Afghanistan, both in terms of the size, the population, its history, when it comes to women's rights, there is a certain commonality where even if you bring in laws, the attitudes in society have not transformed, have not changed. And this is the reality that the majority of women, not women like me, who are privileged, who live in a city like Mumbai, but the majority of the women in India continue to face this. And now we have an additional factor. One of the phrases which I liked I think it was in Rosalind Paczewski's essay, she talked about fundamentalist terrorism. And I think that's a very good description of what people are facing, not just in Afghanistan, but what we are facing here in India. Because we have now a dominant political group which is pushing for the concept of a Hindu nation, as opposed to the concept of equality of religions that was adopted by the founders of the Indian Republic. And this will make women face another set of challenges. For instance, I'll just give you a few instances because most of you perhaps are not so familiar with what's happening here. The savior mentality that I spoke about. So the current government has brought in a law criminalizing what is called triple talaq, or oral divorce, practiced by some Muslims. So while many Muslim women have wanted a custom to end, they certainly don't want this government to have yet more powers to incarcerate Muslim men, which is something that they're already doing on many other levels. So this is another one instance where if the ideology of the ruling group is to bring in religion and to make sure that the dominance of one religious group over all others, then you have this kind of distortion in laws. Another one is what is called love jihad, which has become something that has become a talking point in India. It was just a talking point. Now there are states that are actually bringing in laws so that if a Hindu woman chooses of her own free will to marry a Muslim man, she can be deemed a victim of love jihad or forced conversion to Islam, regardless of the fact that she made that choice. In other words, an Indian woman still cannot make a choice of who she wants to marry, because if she marries somebody from another religion, particularly Islam, she can be charged, the man can be charged with love jihad of forcing this woman to change her religion. And in any case, in many parts of India, irrespective of the community to which you belong, and especially in the smaller towns and the villages, women are monitored for the clothes they wear, and even their access to the use of the ubiquitous mobile phone. We claim we're moving towards a digital India, but you hear stories all the time of how young girls are monitored.
You have 1 minute or two, maybe.
Okay. So anyway, I can tell you more about this, but the point I'm still trying to make is that women are denied equal rights. It cannot be linked to one religion. It is what I call the fundamentalist terrorism that is taking place in India as much as it is in many other countries. And what is happening in Afghanistan is fraught. It is not easy to figure out how we can help. But I think as feminists, as women, as journalists like me, we have to challenge what is the dominant narrative, whether it is one of saving women, whether it's the kind of triumphalist responses that are coming from some Muslim countries, or the alarmist Islamophobic narratives that are taking place elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Kalpana. Our next speaker is Farida Akhter. She is the founding executive director of UBNID, which means Policy Research for Development Alternative, and that was established in 1984. It's a policy and action research organisation in Bangladesh. Its main work is research, campaign and advocacy, and the undertaking of action programs in the field of social development. She's also the force behind the publishing company Narigranta Prabatana, and her books include Women and Trees, 1990, Depopulating Bangladesh, 92, Resisting Norplant, 95, and Seeds of Movements in 2007. Over to you, Farida.
I'm in a village, so the internet connection is not very stable. So if I got stuck, I will connect through the mobile phone, which is already connected. So please bear with me. I'm very happy that Spinifex Press has organized this event today. I think it is very much needed, and to see so many friends today who have joined and who have written on this issue. So I will just touch upon the article that I have written in the book, and it was on Huntington's Clash of Civilization, Thesis and Population Control, because I looked at it from the population control perspective that people like Huntington was proposing. And as a member of FINRAGE, Feminist International Network of for Resistance Against Reproductive and Genetic Engineering, and being a woman from a country, Muslim majority country like Bangladesh, I found Samuel P. Huntington's concern over increased Muslim population in his book, Clash of Civilization. It was very disturbing. He wrote another article in the Newsweek as a continuation of his earlier thesis that Muslim wars have replaced earlier Cold Wars, and termed these wars as wars of terrorism, guerrilla wars, civil wars, and interstate conflicts. He was clearly accusing Muslims for the attack on World Trade Center on September 11, 2001, and said the age of Muslim wars had come to America. He had no proof of that. Let me summarize, what I tried to say in the book, in my article, that wars are essentially terminating unwanted population, or Western population policies are war policies aiming to terminate targeted population based on race, religion, sect, indigenous people, anybody. The population control must be understood as contrary to women's decision of planning for family and to take control over her body. This is not the same thing. And United States of America took the lead of coercive population control policies and programs all over the world, and have used invasive contraceptives, coercive sterilization programs, reducing women's bodies as guinea pigs for developing more and more coercive and invasive methods of contraception. In order to justify depopulating war policies, they used words like terrorist even to the little kids of Palestine who were throwing stones at Israeli soldiers having big tanks and guns and shooting them. So human beings were just numbers in population control. And what we saw that Huntington was trying to project that 39% of the countries have more than 80% of the Muslim population and have high birth rate. So this have to be controlled because they have a youth bulge of age 16 to 30, and they are the main perpetrators. And of course, who produce these perpetrators are the women. And so their reproductive functions need to be controlled and by these population policies. I want to mention here a bit about our feminists around the world, that when FINRAGE, and particularly I was talking around population control policies and critiquing the technologies used for population control, many of our liberal feminists were not agreeing with us, and in fact were rather opposing it, because they thought that having contraceptives was their right. But they did not see the racism behind the population control policies, and that these were population war against women, people of color. So now in 2021, we are facing a new situation in Afghanistan. So I want to touch upon that. When US-led NATO forces have withdrawn and Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan has taken over the government. So first of all, I want to say that any person wanting to fight against the invaders, we would welcome the throwing out of Americans and NATO forces from Afghanistan, because no country should remain under foreign occupation and people have the right to free themselves from occupation. So that has created a lot of destruction in Afghanistan. We remember always only the Taliban regime, which was bad for women, but we don't see that how much destruction was caused, looting was caused, corruption was there by the invaders as well. Of course, the rights of education and others was there, but it was, as Kalpana mentioned, that it was very much in the urban areas, and the rural Afghanistan still remained under the same old feudal patriarchy, and also all the patriarchal violences on women. So actually, these Western forces did not take care of that. And also I want to mention that the Taliban in their first meeting in Doha declared that they will have rights of education to women, but under Sharia law. We have to look at that critically also. And the US forces were not really thinking of the women either. In their meeting with Taliban in 2020, the US government deferred the issue of gender equality. So they took it aside. So that means they were not taking responsibility of the Afghan women after they leave. So we have no reason to believe that they were actually there for the sake of women. So there are some issues that I want to mention, that after September 11 attack on World Trade Center, freedom, quote unquote, was the dominant term used by the US in international political discourse, with the posture of projecting USA as one and only global sovereign power, the one and only universal political and military agency that is the sole authority to decide the wrongs and rights. So Operating Enduring Freedom was the official response to the September 11 attacks. This OEF primarily refers to the war in Afghanistan, but it was also affiliated to the counter-terrorism operations in many other countries.
Farida,
and so,
1 more minute.
Okay, so I want to say that such global reality and use of liberal ideas of freedom, women's rights, and right-based discourses have raised serious questions in the minds of many Muslim women around the world. On the top of it, subjectivity, this is what I want to emphasize, the subjectivity of the Muslim women have been systematically denied, as if they would always need Western power for their salvation. So Muslim women also have their subjective capacity to, so women in the Islamic societies have been struggling against theological patriarchy, and but we also have to realize that there are many other faces of patriarchy, that is capitalist patriarchy, and that is going around. So nobody wants to talk about it, and they are taking away our rights of livelihood, the command over agrarian economy, women in the economy and everything. Now, I just want to say that there is now a lot of concern that the Taliban will take away the rights of women, but we should not realize that these Taliban are saying that they are a new generation Taliban, but at the same time, there is a new generation of Afghan women as well. So it is not the same Afghan women who were in 1996 to 2001. This is the woman in 2021. So we have to also recognize that this new generation of women in Afghanistan and their subjective agency must be taken into account, and we have to be vigilant, and we have to be in solidarity relationship with them in their struggle against patriarchy, be it against Taliban's violence or anything. So this is what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Farida. So we're now going to ask Urvashi Butalia to speak. Urvashi is founder and publisher at Zuban Books and was co-founder with Ritu Menon of Kali for Women in 1984. She is the author of The Other Side of Silence, Voices from the Partition of India, 1998, and Speaking Peace, Women's Voices from Kashmir. She's also written for The Guardian, New Internationalist, The Statesman, Times of India, Outlook, and India Today, as well as being a regular columnist for the Indian left-wing Tehreeka. Urvashi.
Thank you, Susan. Hi, everyone, and thank you to Spinifex for organizing this. And Kalpana and Farida have both laid out much of what I want to say, so that makes my task easier, because what I'm going to say is set against the context of women in South Asia addressing this whole white savior complex, and also the kind of conditions that obtain in our own countries within the context of international politics. So, you know, when Sue asked me to speak on this and mentioned my article in the book, I was completely mystified because I had forgotten what I had written. And I said to her, what are you talking about? And then she reminded me. And then, of course, I didn't have a copy of the book, so I didn't know what to do. And finally, I went on the net and hunted it out, and I found my piece, which is a short little piece I wrote for the New Internationalist. And when I read it again, I thought, okay, it's 20 years ago, and much has changed, but much hasn't changed either. And some of the concerns that I expressed in that piece about what the so-called international intervention in Afghanistan would do have sadly been borne out. All of us have, I mean, I wasn't alone in expressing those concerns. They were widely expressed. You know, the equation of Islam with terror, the impoverishment and the corruption and so on that the Americans brought in, the complications that it would create for women, both good and bad, and many, many other things. So I'm not really going to go into them. But what I want to say is, from the point of view, from where I stand or sit as a writer and a publisher based in South Asia, what does this look like? What does this history tell us? What does it look like? What can we take away from it? And one of the things is that becomes clear is that for women across the world, scholars, activists, others, the last 20 or 30 years have shown us how deeply women are implicated in and impacted by the continuing conflicts, both local and international. And it's not only the kind of thing that we now fear that the Taliban will do, but also the fact that women's health is deeply impacted, also the fact that poverty and food and all of these things are things that impact women more, because they are, of course, dealing with the kind of dual patriarchies that Farida pointed to. But also, one of the things that became, like Kalpana, I have not been to Afghanistan, but India and Afghanistan have had very, very close relationships and very many cultural similarities for many years, but so have Pakistan and Afghanistan. And one of the things that we decided early on was that women's groups in India and Pakistan, and indeed across South Asia, would work together to support their Afghani sisters. But it did not only get left at that, because the Taliban is like the virus, you know, which we are facing today. When it finds it's not effective in one place, it moves to another. So, and it uses very different tactics. So there is a very long and terrible history of the Taliban in the early 2000s, 2006 onwards, in an area of Pakistan known as Swat, where a Taliban leader called Mullah Fazlullah began his takeover of the region by addressing women through a radio program, and where women came out in large numbers to support him because he did the kind of thing that fundamentalists easily do, which is to deal with domestic issues. And where then the next thing came, which was the clamp down on women's rights and the pushing of women into the homes and forced marriages and so on and so forth. And this is what culminates in the shooting of Malala in 2012. This is all taking place in that region. And Swat Swati feminists, Swati women and Pakistani women are actually countering and fighting this. And what also happens subsequently is that the army moves in, and the army comes with secular progressive credentials, and they push the Taliban out, and women react thinking this is wonderful. But then they are faced with what militarization brings with it. So I cite this instance to say that within South Asia, South Asian feminist scholars are now creating a lot of knowledge on what happens to women and the complex consequences of such moments of violence on the lives of women, which are really contradictory and paradoxical. And how do we come to understand them, and how do we come to deal with them? And to me, this is one of the big changes that has happened from the early 2000s, or from 2001, or you can take it from September 11 or before, or the late 90s, in fact, to the moment today, when not only are we engaging deeply with what is going on with women in our countries as a consequence of local and international battles, but we are creating knowledge about it. And that knowledge arms us, sorry to use that phrase, to go ahead and find different ways of countering and understanding what is going on. And I think to me, that's really important. Sue, do I have one more minute, or is my time up?
1 more minute, no
One
more.
more minute. So with 1 more minute, I just want to tell you another story that connects South Asian women, which is, it's a fictional story written by a Pakistani writer. And the story is based on a film about an Afghani man who comes to India to sell his wares, and who is very, very lonely for Afghanistan and remembers Kabul and sings beautiful songs. These have become part of our childhood. And a little girl befriends him, and she becomes his anchor and his sense of home. And then, of course, he's forced to go back. Then that little girl grows up and becomes a grandmother, and her granddaughter goes into modern day Afghanistan to work and tries to seek out all the relationships that that man's descendants would have had, and which she can send back to her grandmother to say what is happening in Kabul. And of course, what is happening is very, very different from what it began with, the story that began it. And therefore, she tells her grandmother all kinds of stories which tell the truth but don't tell the truth, to in some ways just keep the connections going. So I think that if we can keep those connections going, and I think feminists are very good at this, then at least we'll have some hope out of this disaster. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Urvashi. So we're moving further west now. Evelyn Akkad was born and raised in Beirut, Lebanon. She is Professor Emerita at the University of Illinois and Lebanese American University, and has taught comparative literature, African studies, women's studies, French and Middle Eastern studies. Among her books are Sexuality and War, Literary Masks of the Middle East, 1990, and The Wounded Breast, Intimate Journeys Through Cancer. She is co-founder of Beit El Hanane, a women's shelter in Beirut, and she's speaking today from Paris. Evelyn.
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak here. And like the rest of you, I went back to the book that was written about 20 years ago, September 11, and I found it to be so actual. I was really amazed at the fact that it was so actual, because I was supposed to be in Beirut right now, but you know, last summer I was hit by this explosion and almost died, and have to have treatment here consequently, because everything in Lebanon is frozen right now. In case you don't know, the whole area we don't know what's really going on. Why is it frozen? Why is it that we don't know what's really what's happening? Why do we have the question that we ask all the time? Why do we have to suffer so much? What is hidden behind all the situations that we are facing? You know, Lebanon right now has had to have 2 million refugees Syria, Iraq, and the countries around plagued with wars, and 2 million refugees for a small country of 3 million. You can imagine how unhandleable all of this is. And on top of it, we have this dramatic situation where right now there is no mazout, no electricity. The hospitals barely can work. There is no medicine coming in except from NGOs. Now the government is completely not working, not forming itself, and the people are suffering tremendously. The shelter that I have opened with my sister about 10 years ago, 11, 12 years ago, is barely functioning. We had to move the women from one area to another to have a little more electricity so we can function and at least not have all the food deteriorate in the refrigerator. There is no refrigeration when you have no electricity. So the situation is totally dramatic. So when I was reading this book again, I thought, my God, here we are 20 years after. And, you know, we at the end of the introduction, Susan and Bronwyn were reaffirming our conviction that unless feminist analysis of male violence is taken seriously, there will be no end to war, and women will continue to pay the highest price. And I find myself that we are in the same situation, even worse. So what can we learn? What can we do in front of an economy, a world economy, based on increasing military power, selling weapons, and we seem to be stuck in a situation where I see no hope. Frankly, I'm quite desperate. So I hope, I know that this event this morning is giving me, re-energizing me a little bit, but the fact that we now have in Afghanistan a similar situation as we were facing also 20 years ago, or even more, 50 years ago, is making us really ask questions. And I remember writing a song, and we don't have time for me to sing, but I wrote a song where I say that violence begets violence. Vengeance repeats itself in blood. There is a procession of all innocents dying, and that war conceives only war. Hatred breeds only fear, anger of all these innocents, and mostly women, and children, and hopeless people. So anyway, I come with you very heavy with these questions, hoping that we can find some window, something to give hope. I was just talking to some people in Lebanon now, and they are so desperate. They don't know what to do. They don't know what they are going to face next in this turmoil. How can it get worse than this? Every time they are sending us supposedly ships, but there is fighting over who is sending us, of all these big power, who is sending, why should there be even fighting about who is sending relief for the people to survive, for a country to survive? This is unacceptable. So anyway, I'm very thankful that I was given this opportunity. And maybe I will end with a quote from Robin Morgan, who was writing 20 years ago on September 11. And she said, even as we mourn, we somehow must continue to dare audaciously to envision and revision a different way, a way out of this savage age, to a time when our species will look back and gasp, recoiling of its own former barbarism. Even as we weep, we must somehow reorganize to reaffirm our capacity to change the world, each other's and ourselves, to insist, even in the teeth of despair, on a politics that is possible and necessary, a politics not a thanatos of death, but of eros and joys and joy. Thank you.
Thank you, Evelyn. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is my co-editor, Bronwyn Winter. She is Emeritus Professor of Transnational Studies at the University of Sydney. She has long combined transnational activism and academe. Work she has authored include Hijab and the Republic, Uncovering the French Headscarf Debate, 2008, and at the end of last year, The Political Economy of Same-Sex Marriage, in which she looks at how states and markets appropriate the issue of same-sex marriage to consolidate their power. She lives on Gadigal country in Sydney.
Gadigal and Wongal, actually.
Okay.
Marrickville is both. I first must apologize for the rather ghostly look you're getting. It's the LED lights that, are helping me read my notes, and they cast a rather strange light. So, I sort of look like I've just risen from the dead or something. So apologies for that. There's also occasional cat interventions coming past. So you may see a cat every now and then. Yeah, what can I say? Oh yeah, I also wanted to add that in 2017, I actually published a follow-up monograph to the 9/11 book that Susan and I did together. It was a hard book to write and it took several years to put together, but it sort of canvasses different themes and situations, combined sort of theoretical and empirical work and in different contexts in Israel, Palestine, in the Philippines and various other parts of the world, looking at how or whether 9/11 changed the world for women. It's called Women, Insecurity and Violence in a Post-9/11 World. In listening to everybody, and particularly Evelyne just now, I'm thinking, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The more things change, the more they say the same. And if there's anything I have seen in the last 20 years, it's the triumph of entrepreneurial warfare. And when I talk about entrepreneurial warfare, we've moved way past the military-industrial complex of which Eisenhower spoke in 1961. When I speak of entrepreneurial warfare, I'm not only speaking of the triumph of neoliberal capitalism and its enrichment through arms, but I'm also talking about the triumph of toxic masculinity, of which is the core component upon which capitalism springs. And we're seeing that everywhere. We're seeing it with the Taliban. We're seeing it with our ScoMo here in Australia, our Prime Minister. We're seeing it with Boris Johnson, and the idiot in the United States, who thankfully is now voted out. But things aren't necessarily getting a whole lot better yet there. Duterte in the Philippines, there's so many different cases I could cite. And it's not just about leaders, it's about the people who vote for them. It's about the anti-vaxxers holding violent demonstrations and punching horses in the streets of Sydney. It's about this toxic masculinity that is permeating our cultures. And Kalpana said at the beginning that Diane might as well have been talking about India. And yes, might as well have been talking about a whole lot of countries, because that toxic masculinity is pervasive. I don't equate what the Taliban are doing. I don't think about a Western Taliban, because I think that sort of amalgam is as little use to us as the white men saving brown women from brown men, which was Gayatri Spivak's phrase. Not that I'm a great fan of Gayatri Spivak, but it was her phrase. And a lot of you have talked about this idea of saving Muslim women. And I think that's not a useful narrative. We know that it was the moral pretext for the so-called war on terror. And it was, a very thin veneer cast over the sorts of actions that the US state and its allies engaged in Afghanistan. But I think it's just as simplistic to talk about, oh, well, it's everywhere the same, and we have our fundamentalists, and we have this, and we have that. Well, yes, we do, but it's not everywhere the same. Even when we talk about the Muslim world or the West, and we like to talk about the West as being some universal, monolithic, everyone's the same bad guy. Well, no. The West is just as diverse as any other part of the world. And I really think we need to start getting rid of these sorts of blanket, simplistic types of things that we use as slogans or memes to help us cope. yeah, to help us get a grasp on what's happening. A case in point, and it's something I've ranted on Facebook about, and I'm going to rant a bit more about it here. It's sort of, people feel angry and despairing and helpless at the same time. And I think there's a feeling of that pervading a lot of what people are saying today. But in response to those feelings, people are sort of grabbing sort of whatever clickbait they can on social media and putting that out there. What got put out there recently, last week, an Italian man latched on, and maybe he wasn't the first, but that's who passed it on to me, latched on a photographic work by a Yemeni photographer whose name is Bushra Mutawakel. And she did a series of photographs called Mother, Daughter, Doll in 2010. And Mother, Daughter, Doll, you see through 8 photographs, you see the mother, the daughter, and her doll being progressively veiled and shadowed. So at the end, they've got a black face veil, gloves, and everything, even the doll. Yeah, so it's progressively happening. And that was her reflection on what was happening in Yemen. She's also done a series, and that was herself and her daughter. She's also done a series with a man, maybe her husband, I don't know, where it's What If? And that was in 2014, where you see the woman progressively becoming unveiled and the man progressively becoming veiled. And I think that What If is a very, you know, if men had to a feminist slogan was once, if men got pregnant, abortion would be a sacrament, if men had to veil, and so on and so forth, yes? Now, what bothered me, and the reason I'm telling you about this, is that this was put on Facebook as a meme by this guy. And I haven't noticed that Italian men are particularly anti-sexist, but, you know, maybe I'm missing something. He said it was a photograph called The Disappearance of Women, which was not its title, by an Iranian photographer. And he did not name that photographer. And that has done the tour. You know, it's gone all over Facebook, all over the place on social media. And it's this meme. It's become this clickbait for people to make this facile statement about the Muslim world or the Taliban. And the photographer was not even named. Can you imagine anybody publishing the work of an Australian photographer or a French photographer or a United Statian photographer and not naming the person and getting their nationality wrong? That sort of facile reaction disturbed me very, very deeply, because it just does that sort of amalgamation of, you know, all over the Muslim world, it's all the same. And no, it's not. Yes, it is. There are some commonalities, just as in the West, there are some commonalities. But if we just say the Western Taliban, or we have fundamentalism here too, that is not helpful either. We need to get a little bit more sophisticated. We need to actually be able to talk about the generalities without negating the specifics. And all my life, through all my academic and activist work, I've tried to sort of focus on those two things. I don't think the universal and the particular are in opposition. I don't think they're in opposition at all. I think we have particular experiences. We are particularly located. I have the great good fortune to be born in a Western liberal democracy with English as my native language. I consider myself extremely fortunate from that point of view, given the global power relations we have, because that gives me a facility in the world that other people may not have. You know, I met an Icelandic woman who spoke 4 languages. And I said, wow, you're a polyglot. And she said, well, I have no choice. I come from Iceland. Nobody speaks Icelandic. Yeah, so it's really, I think, the sorts of uphill climbs that anybody else has to, other people have to do to get onto a global platform that I don't have to make. I have that great good fortune. I try to tell my students in international relations that, or I tried to when I was teaching them, and they don't get it. These little privileged little Anglophones that walk into the classroom in a very elite university in Australia, they don't get it. They don't get how lucky they are to be native speakers of English. Anyway, the whole reason I'm saying that is, no, it's not the same as being a woman in Afghanistan. And if we try to sort of say, well, everything's the same and we all have our oppressors and we all have our fundamentalisms, well, no, we don't. And to try to say so is simplistic, and it actually doesn't help us. It helps us to understand the sorts of threads of toxic masculinity, of the rise of religious fundamentalisms that we see in the United States, in France, in Australia, in Lebanon, in Israel, in Palestine, and a whole bunch of other places in the world. And we see it take different expressions and develop different power. And we see those sorts of toxic masculinities and religious fundamentalisms and money, because what we're not talking about much with the Taliban is how damn rich they are. They get rich off the opium trade, they get rich off real estate, they get rich off charitable donations, they get rich off extortion, they get rich off all sorts of things, yeah, gun running and so on. So the Taliban are actually extremely wealthy. And yes, they may be traditionalist, but they're really, really savvy. Any fundamentalist movement in the world is extremely savvy about using modern technology and modern so-called democratic appeal. Yeah? And they're really good about using the media. There's this guy in France called Tariq Ramadan, who's an absolute bastard. He's a fundamentalist. He's the grandson of the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, which isn't his fault, but he sort of thinks like them. And he uses sort of this suave, personable, I'm such a nice guy thing. And he became this media star. And he got charged with rape, which we sort of all were quite happy about because, you know, that sort of exposed him for what he really was. But we mustn't forget that the fundamentalists of the world, whether we're talking Hillsong, whether we're talking Opus Dei, whether we're talking, you know, Hamas, whether we're talking the Taliban, etc., whether we're talking the BJP in India, they know how to use the modern technologies. They know how to smile for the cameras. They know how to say, oh, yes, 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 we'll respect women's. What's the Taliban saying to us now? We'll respect women's rights within the limits of Sharia. So we need to be really, you know, careful not to sort of have traditionalists versus the West. And I actually agree with that. We, the West, we're so modern and liberated, and the Muslim world, they're so backward. Well, no, that's actually not the case.
Bronwyn, you have one.
Okay, yeah, I'm about to finish. But at the same time, I'm really, really wary of trying to draw some equivalence between, oh, us here in Australia and what's happening to women in Afghanistan, because it is not the same. We can have this seminar here in Australia. We can talk, we can publish, we can walk about in shorts as women and so on. Yeah, it is not the same. And when we start thinking it's the same and we have our Talibans here, without trying to understand the different situations that are traversed by commonalities, but they're still different. Until we start having those conversations transnationally across those differences, to be able to tease out the commonalities and the ways in which we can work together across differences of oppression and limits on our freedoms, then we're really nowhere. And the simplistic memes and the simplistic, you know, Western Taliban, etc., is not going to be helpful to us. We've got to be able to move forward in a much more sophisticated way, because we have an extremely sophisticated enemy that has declared war on all women in this world. And we really need to recognize that enemy in all its faces. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. Yes, indeed, we do. Now, if anybody would like to ask a question and speaking it, please go down to the reactions section on the second one from the right and put up your hand, and I'll be able to see your hand going up, and then you should unmute yourself and ask your question, and please identify who you'd like to have answer your question. You can also write things in the chat, but that's harder for me to keep track of. So I prefer, if you have questions, that you do it in using the reactions button.
All right. So with our collective wisdom, what is to be done?
That's the question.
Actually, there is something I did forget to say. I was going to screen share something. There's a meeting for those of you in Australia, there's a meeting on Zoom tomorrow. Women's International Solidarity Australia and a Victorian group whose name I momentarily forget are organising a Zoom meeting. I'll see if I can do a screen share on exactly what's going on, and they're going to have an overview of the current situation presented by Saman Wahidi, followed by discussion of current on-the-ground experiences in Afghanistan and what we can do in Australia. And they're really good women organising this. I know some of them personally, I can vouch for them. I'm just going to try and screen share. Okay, here we go. All right, so I'm going to just try and find the damn, there it is, okay. Can you see that document?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm just going to leave it up there for a minute while we all talk and while other women might want to say something. I see that there are some hands up, but I'll just leave that document there so people can make note if they wish.
Okay. I need to move it to the side so I can see the hands up. Now I can't see the hands up.
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out if I'm muted or unmuted, because with the screen share, I can't really see
Fiona,
what's going on. I was actually just really interested in some of the thinking around the division between urban and rural in Afghanistan, and experiences of the different experiences of rural women compared to urban women, particularly, I suppose, because I have a lot of friends who are military or former military in both the American, British and Australian militaries. And obviously they spent significant amounts of time out of Kabul. And certainly some of the things that some of the women that told me about what they saw indicates that the experiences are very different. So I'm quite interested in thinking about that, particularly in terms of my own work, where I've begun thinking about the role of women in oppressive regimes, and particularly female perpetrators of oppression, atrocity, and war crimes. And I suppose I'm quite interested to hear the thoughts of anyone on the panel about that kind of issue, about the role that sort of women have played or may have played or continue to play in that development and the development and the perpetuation of oppressive regimes, particularly those that we're sort of seeing sort of developing and becoming more prominent in Afghanistan and across the world. Now I'll try to mute myself.
Somebody has just asked in the chat whether we have any recommendations on specific Afghan women's organisations. I did try to get in touch with RAWA, the Revolutionary Association of Afghani Women. I can understand why they might not respond at this time. We also were trying to get Val Moghadam, but 4 a.m. in the US is a bit of a challenging time zone for this, so she wasn't able to participate. But, you know, nevertheless, I think you can only keep a lookout online for things and then try to figure out whether the organisation is really one you want to follow or not. Now, Zol, you have your hand up, and I'm thinking you might be going to talk about the Zoom that you're running on Saturday.
Well, I will, but right now I just want to ask a question and give some information. The Women's International League for Peace and Freedom has got a letter campaign going, and we've got members in Afghanistan at the moment that everyone's very concerned about. Australia's got a long history of Afghan populations, people here. But with the pandemic going on, so many people are sort of like sidelined. So has anyone been thinking about how to actually engage the people that actually care about Afghanistan? Because a lot of people are caring right now. That's my question.
Wow. Does anybody have an answer for that? I know that Phyllis Chesler has been trying to help at least one woman out of Afghanistan, and I'm not entirely sure if she's managed to get some success, but I think there may have been 6 women who were able to get to the airport. But, you know, the news is just terrible, and, you know, if you can't get to the airport, then there's no plane to get onto. So yeah, I don't know the answer to your question, Zol.
Just the link I posted in the chat for the meeting tomorrow, I stopped the screen share and I posted it in the chat as someone reminded me I could. And there's solidarity for the women of Afghanistan, or solidarity for Afghan women in Australia, or something like that, called SAWA. They do fundraisers quite a lot for women. Women's International Solidarity Australia is organising an event tomorrow. They are actually asking for donations, and they have really good sort of backdoor ways of getting money to women so that they can actually have resources to help, to get out, to do what they need to do, to also organise and campaign. Because if all the women leave, or if women who can leave, you know, there's also women who may choose to stay and fight, but they also need resources to do that. So, you know, and you know, those who leave should not be blamed any more than those who stay should be portrayed as heroes. But you know, there are choices that each individual woman has to make in those situations, and they're not easy ones.
Susan,
yes,
there is a on the chat there is a mention from the Human Rights Campaign they have compiled a list of organizations. So that's on the chat.
Okay.
I mean, that's the problem, isn't it? With all this stuff, we don't even really know who to contact, who, you know, to send money to, if we have any money to send. And so, but I trust Women's Human Rights Campaign, and it's on the chat there, the compilation.
Any more questions? And if not, then I will move on to thanking everyone.
Susan, there are a couple of questions that sort of, I think, got addressed to me. One was on toxic masculinity. Yes, all masculinity is toxic. I saw the comments, but I suppose I want to use the toxic because I think it has reached a particular level of toxicity over the last 20 years. And I think we've gone backwards in many, many ways since 9/11. And I think that's an observation that many have made. Either things haven't got better or they've actually got worse. And I think Evelyne can, definitely vouch for that with what's happening in Afghanistan, and where she is in France, it's not pretty rosy either. So I think we've really gone backwards in a lot of ways. So if I'm talking about toxic masculinity, it's a little bit like talking about entrepreneurial warfare. Just sort of to point out that does the extreme levels it has reached. It's not to say that I don't think that masculinity and femininity as any sort of values are toxic. I think they both are. But the toxic masculinity is a particular degree of hyper masculinity and hyper male supremacism that is extremely worrying at this point in time, which is why I use the term.
Evelyn, you have your hand up?
Yes, I do. Yes. I wanted to ask if there is any possibility of having another book like that 20 years later, to see what we can do. And I'm reminded every time I was in conferences with Nawal Saadawi, one of the things she was very eager to was always to organize women all over and say that we have to take actions to see if there is anything that we can do to move this world into a different place. Have more women into positions of power, have more women leaders. There are very beautiful women in Lebanon who could take the leadership. Why aren't these women pushed forward? What can we do to push them forward? What are some of the actions that we could actually do to we don't want to sit and despair, which is how I felt before the meeting. I feel a little bit more uplifted now, but is there any chance we could do something?
Well,
and thank you for what you have been.
There's no easy answer to that question. We're so exhausted at the moment. The thought of another anthology is just, but if anybody wants to put together a proposal, you can always send it to us. But at this stage, we're not thinking another anthology, but it doesn't mean that it's utterly impossible. But yeah, maybe if every contributor found somebody else who they think is in the next generation who could write something, that might be a way to proceed. But beyond that, I wouldn't know, because I wouldn't know who to contact. So,
of course.
I think the generational thing you mentioned, Susan, is incredibly important. I'm looking at the age demographic of our audience, and I'm, I know women I know personally, I love you to bits, but I'm sometimes a little worried that we're not getting across a generational divide, that, like a lot of younger women I've been talking to in social media didn't know this book existed.
Yeah.
They're very pleased to know it existed. So I think it certainly is the moment to sort of hand over the baton, or whatever metaphor you wish to use, that we actually do need to encourage younger women who are thinking along these lines to actually also participate in some sort of collective work on this. The where to publish is an issue, because, as Susan said, they're exhausted at Spinifex. There's only so much one, relatively small publisher can do. University publishers are horrendously expensive to purchase the books, and you have to go through all this peer reviewing stuff that, you know, we really don't want to have to bother with because we've got urgent things to say. Not that peer reviewing is not a useful exercise, but it's also very constraining. Yeah. One wonderful thing about the book that we did with Susan, which is actually not my idea nor Susan's in the first place, it was the idea of somebody who's actually listening in tonight who suggested I should write a book about that, and I went, oh no, that's too big. So I approached Susan. I said, let's do a transnational anthology, which is what we did. It was an extraordinarily fast book. You put it to Routledge or, you know, Syracuse University Press or Oxford, you know, Cambridge University Press or whoever, you know, it's going to take 2 years to get into print. This book got into print. It was published almost exactly 19 years ago. We started in October.
It was published on September 11, 2002. So 1 year after September 11, we had it in the shops. Which was,
but we had it in print before that because I did a launch event at ANU in August.
Well, we may have done. We probably had copies available, but yes, it was,
anyway. So it was.
Yeah.
Yes, in any case, it was less than a year, but and it had an urgency about it at that time, and I feel that same sense of urgency now. I've just got a whole lot less energy.
Well, I think I am going to have to wind up and say my thank yous. So thanks to Rachel McDermott for setting up the Eventbrite at short notice and for also co-hosting, and to Bronwyn also for co-hosting tonight, because it's really hard to talk and watch and see everything and admit people, and you actually do need about 3 brains to do it. Thank you to everyone else at Spinifex, most of whom are currently in lockdown. I'm just going to show the final page so that you can see how to order the book if you don't happen to have it. So to everyone at Spinifex, Marilyn Damiano, Office Manager, Sharon Murphy, Warehouse Manager, Pauline Hopkins, Senior Editor, Caitlin Roper, Social Media Manager, and of course, Renata Klein, Publisher and Co-founder with me of Spinifex Press. So, and finally, to all the speakers today who were only asked last week if they could participate, I think Urvashi, I think I asked you on the weekend, and to all of you who have joined this Zoom tonight. It's lovely to see you all, and I'm hoping that we can do many more wonderful Zooms. They're getting a bit frequent, but it's actually terrific. I'm getting used to it. Thank you everybody for being part of it.